In the highest peaks of the Swiss Alps, there was a place where the dying went to breathe. That is the story you were told. The truth is, it's where their breath was taken, slowly, methodically, until nothing remained but a perfect, frozen vessel. They called it the Weisshorn Sanatorium, a palace of glass and white stone, gleaming against the ice, a promise of life whispered on the thin, pure air. But the men who built it were not healers. They were architects of a new kind of eternity. Before we ascend that mountain, a warning. This channel is a key, not a comfort. It unlocks rooms in history that were sealed for a reason. If you seek easy answers or gentle stories, you are in the wrong place. But if you have the strength to witness the true price of ambition, to understand how progress is so often paid for in blood, then subscribe now. Show us you are ready to awaken. What makes the Weisshorn's legacy so profoundly disturbing is not that people died there. It was a sanatorium for the terminally ill. Death was expected. The horror lies in how they were used. This was not a failure of medicine to save lives. It was the calculated, monstrous success of a science that sought to conquer death itself, using the dying as its raw material. A grand experiment in suspended animation, disguised as compassionate end-of-life care. The year is 1892. Europe is choking on coal smoke and consumption. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, is a death sentence. But for the incredibly wealthy, there is a glimmer of hope: the new Alpine sanatoriums. High above the world, in the unforgiving cradle of the Alps, the Weisshorn was the most exclusive, the most remote. Accessible only by a private, terrifyingly steep cog railway, it was a fortress of solitude. Its isolation was not for the peace of its patients. It was for the secrecy of its work. Buried in snow for 9 months of the year, cut off from the world below, it was the perfect laboratory, sealed from the inconveniences of law, morality, and God. The architects arrived not as conquerors, but as saviors. Dr. Alastair Finch was the visionary, the public face of the enterprise, a man of devastating charm, with eyes the color of a winter sky that seemed to look straight through flesh and bone, assessing the strength of the soul within. When he spoke, his voice was a mesmerizing cadence of English aristocracy and scientific fervor, promising a future where the body's frailties could be held in perfect, pristine abeyance. He carried credentials from Vienna and London, documents that spoke of a brilliant mind whose theories were deemed too ambitious by his more cowardly peers. He was a prophet cast out by a world not yet ready for his gospel. His partner was a man who seemed more a part of the mountain than a visitor to it. Mr. Emil Kale, the engineer. A hulking, silent figure of Swiss-German origin, Kale never spoke in public. His hands, thick and scarred, looked as though they could bend steel, and they moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if he were constantly calculating stresses and tolerances. He was the one who translated Finch's soaring vision into cold, hard reality. His stare was not penetrating like Finch's. It was utterly blank, the dispassionate gaze of a man who saw people not as patients, but as complex systems of pressures and fluids waiting to be stabilized. They claimed their funding came from an anonymous philanthropic consortium of Europe's wealthiest industrialists, men who wished to see the scourge of consumption wiped from the earth. The truth was far more precise. Their backers were a secret society of men obsessed with their own mortality, who saw in Finch's work not a cure for the sick, but a bridge to a kind of immortality for themselves. The gold they provided seemed limitless. They purchased the remote mountain plateau from the Swiss government for a sum that could have funded a small army, silencing any bureaucratic questions before they could even be formed. The construction of the Weisshorn Sanatorium became a local legend. For 2 years, an army of laborers toiled under Kale's silent, unblinking supervision. The public-facing structure was a masterpiece of Belle Epoque design, sweeping verandas, vast panes of glass to catch the sun, and elegant rooms promising comfort and clean air. But beneath this fragile shell of civility, a second, more monstrous facility was being built. The foundations were sunk to an impossible depth. The sub-basements were cavernous, reinforced with steel and concrete, their walls threaded with a dense web of copper and brass pipes, thick as a man's arm. Workers whispered about the private power station, a massive humming behemoth disguised as a simple heating plant, capable of generating more electricity than the city of Geneva. They wondered why a hospital needed ventilation systems that could flash freeze the air, and doors made of solid steel, sealed with pressure gauges and locking wheels like the hatch of a submarine. Finch's explanations were always ready, always plausible. The absolute purification of air requires extreme cryogenic temperatures, he would explain to visiting officials. And to contain that process, one needs architecture of uncompromising strength. His words, delivered with such confident authority, painted a picture of cutting-edge therapy. The reality was a cage, built to contain not a disease, but the very process of life itself. To legitimize this grand deception, they needed a collaborator, someone reputable, brilliant, and most importantly, ambitious enough to overlook the strangeness. They found her in Zurich. Dr. Anneliese Schmidt was a rising star in pulmonology, a gifted physician trapped by the glass ceiling of 19th-century academia. She was frustrated, hungry for recognition, and tired of seeing her research dismissed by older, less imaginative men. Dr. Finch did not offer her a job, he offered her a kingdom. He sought her out, praising her latest paper on cellular respiration in hypoxic environments. He showed her the blueprints, the sanitized, public version, and spoke of a facility where science would be unburdened by budget or bureaucracy. He promised her unlimited resources, a staff to command, and the chance to put her name on a discovery that would change the world. He would handle the patient's metaphysical well-being, he said, while she would be the undisputed master of their physical care. For a woman who had fought for every scrap of respect, the offer was intoxicating. Her journal, recovered years later from the ashes of her life, documents the seduction. October 14, 1892. I have met a man who speaks the language of the future. Dr. Finch is not merely a physician, he is a force of nature. He described the Weisshorn not as a sanatorium, but as a temple to the art of healing. The resources he has placed at my disposal are beyond my wildest dreams. Here, on this mountaintop, I feel I can finally do the work I was born to do. There is an intensity in his eyes, a fire that some might find unsettling, but I recognize it for what it is, the flame of pure genius. But as the facility neared completion, a seed of unease was planted. March 5, 1893. I toured the lower levels with Herr Kale today, or rather, I followed him in silence as he inspected his domain. The man is a ghost. He moves through the machinery as if it were an extension of his own body. The cold in sublevel 3 is profound. It is not the simple chill of a cellar. It is an active, aggressive cold that feels as if it is leaching the warmth from your very bones. I can hear a low, constant hum from behind the sealed steel doors, a sound that vibrates deep in my chest. Dr. Finch assures me it is all part of the aeration and preservation process. His logic is sound, but the feeling of that place. It is the feeling of a tomb, a meticulously engineered, perfectly functioning tomb. Weisshorn's reputation became a legend whispered in the drawing rooms of Paris and the exclusive clubs of London. It was the final gilded chapter for those whose stories were ending. The cost was astronomical, a king's ransom paid not for a cure. Everyone understood there was no cure, but for a dignified, painless, and scientifically managed descent. Families sent their dying loved ones here to be spared the final, ugly ravages of the disease. They were purchasing peace. They were buying a beautiful end. The clientele was a roster of Europe's doomed elite, a German industrial baron whose lungs had turned to dust, a celebrated French poet coughing up blood in sonnets, a British heiress whose beauty was being consumed from within. They were all bound by two things, immense wealth and the inexorable advance of the White Plague. They came to the mountain to die beautifully. The first crack in this pristine facade appeared on a stark, clear, silent night in the winter of 1894. It came from Elspeth, a young nurse from a village in the valley below. Devoutly religious, she saw her work as a sacred calling, a duty to bring comfort to souls preparing to meet their Maker. She was known for her quiet compassion and was trusted by the senior staff, though kept far from the sanatorium's true purpose. One night, a patient, a Mr. Dubois from Lyon, took a sudden turn. Dr. Schmidt was off duty, and the night supervisor, a man loyal to Finch, ordered Elspeth to fetch a specific canister of respiratory stimulants from a storage locker in sublevel 2. The task was unusual. Nurses were forbidden from the lower levels. The cold in the stairwell was shocking, seeping through her thick wool uniform, a dead, artificial cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. As she located the locker, she heard it, not a scream, but its opposite. A deep, resonant hum that vibrated up through the soles of her shoes, a sound that felt ancient and wrong. And from further down the corridor, from behind one of the massive steel doors leading to the forbidden sublevel 3C, came the faint, rhythmic hiss of gas. The door was marked Cryogenic Suite 1, no admittance, but tonight it was not fully sealed. A sliver of brilliant, blue-white light bled from the crack. Driven by a dreadful curiosity she couldn't name, Elspeth crept closer. She peered through the gap. The scene inside was not one of medical care, but of silent, ritualistic horror. The room was a chamber of polished steel and frosted pipes, bathed in a sterile, shadowless light. In the center, on a metal table that looked more like an altar, lay Mr. Dubois. He was not dead. His eyes were open, wide with a silent, pleading terror. He was restrained by gleaming metal cuffs, but he wasn't struggling. He was too cold to move. Herr Kale stood at a vast control panel, his back to her, adjusting dials with slow precision. Dr. Finch was at the patient's side, not comforting him, but observing him with the focused intensity of a watchmaker. He held a delicate silver instrument to Mr. Dubois' temple, while a network of fine tubes fed a shimmering, super-chilled gas onto his exposed skin. Elspeth watched, frozen, as frost began to form on the living man's eyelashes, on the hairs of his arm. His breath, which had been coming in shallow rasps, became a faint plume of vapor, then another, then nothing. The terror in his eyes did not fade. It was frozen there, captured in the moment his last bit of warmth was stolen. Finch made a note in a ledger with a calm, steady hand, as if recording the temperature of a chemical reaction. They were not saving him. They were stopping him. Like a photograph, they were fixing him in a state of perfect, horrifying preservation. Elspeth didn't remember fleeing. She found herself in Dr. Schmidt's private quarters, babbling hysterical. The image of those frozen eyes burned into her mind. Dr. Schmidt's face went white. For a moment, Elspeth saw a flicker of genuine horror in the doctor's eyes, a shared humanity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold professional mask. "Elspeth, you are overwrought," she said, her voice sharp, cutting. "You have witnessed a radical new procedure. A cryotherapeutic induction. We are attempting to halt the cellular decay at the moment of clinical death, to preserve the body for future study. It is a heroic, experimental effort. You misunderstood." "But he was alive," Elspeth wept. "He was looking at me." "The body has residual nerve activity," Dr. Schmidt snapped, her voice now devoid of any warmth. "You are a junior nurse. You are not qualified to interpret what you saw. You will speak of this to no one. If you do, your career will be over. You will be dismissed as a hysterical, incompetent girl who cannot handle the pressures of this work. Do you understand me?" It was a threat, delivered with the chilling authority of someone sealing a tomb. Elspeth, broken and terrified, fled to the chapel, but she knew the difference between medicine and monstrosity. The deception held, but the doubt had been planted. A few weeks later, it was watered by an unexpected arrival. Lord Harrington, the eldest son of a British patient, arrived unannounced, a man whose powerful, skeptical nature was a direct threat to the sanatorium's fragile peace. He demanded to see his father. Dr. Finch met him personally, his voice a symphony of calm compassion. "My lord," he began, "your father has entered a new phase of his treatment, a deep, restorative stasis. We have arrested the disease's progress. It is a delicate state, and he cannot be disturbed." Finch led Harrington not to a sick room, but to an observation window set into one of the thick, insulated walls of the main facility. Through the triple-paned, lightly frosted glass, Lord Harrington could see his father, lying peacefully in a pristine white bed, looking more like a wax sculpture than a living man. He looked perfect, too perfect. The wasting illness seemed to have been erased. "This is remarkable," Harrington admitted, his voice tight with suspicion. "He looks better than he has in years." "The cold preserves, my lord," Finch said smoothly. "It purifies, it holds the decay at bay." But Harrington was a man who noticed details. He pressed his hand to the glass. It was intensely, unnaturally cold. He saw no rise and fall of his father's chest. "Is he breathing?" he asked, his voice sharp. "The metabolic processes are suspended to a degree almost undetectable," Finch replied without missing a beat, a cascade of scientific jargon flowing from him, speaking of anaerobic cellular states and neural preservation. Harrington did not understand the words, but he understood the intention behind them, to overwhelm, to confuse, to deflect. He left the sanatorium that day with a profound sense of wrongness. He had no proof, no evidence to give the authorities. All he had was the memory of his father, looking like a perfect statue in a refrigerated display case, and the chilling feeling that he had not been visit. "Ing a hospital, but a museum." After the incidents with Nurse Elspeth and Lord Harrington, the Weisshorn became a fortress of silence. Finch, ever the master of perception, announced a new protocol of absolute restorative quiet. The beautiful, sunlit verandas were now often empty. An unnerving stillness descended upon the mountain, a silence more profound and terrifying than any scream. Security patrols, led by grim-faced men hired from outside the valley, became a constant presence. The upper floors felt like a mausoleum, but the lower levels began to hum with a new, more intense energy. The successes were now communicated not in person, but through carefully composed letters and, most disturbingly, through photographs. The family of Baroness von Hesse, a Viennese socialite famed for her porcelain beauty, received a package 3 months after her arrival. Inside was a letter from Dr. Finch, speaking in lyrical prose of how the Baroness had achieved a perfect and stable state of preservation, her mortal beauty arrested at its peak, shielded forever from the ravages of time and disease. With the letter was a photograph, a marvel of the new art form. It showed the Baroness, seemingly asleep in a bed of white silk, her skin flawless, a gentle smile on her lips. But her family, who knew her intimately, saw the horror. It was not the look of sleep. It was the look of a priceless doll stored in a glass case. Her beauty wasn't resting. It was captured, inert, a permanent monument to the moment her life was stolen. The case of Julien, a brilliant young composer from Paris, was different. His family was told he had entered a deep stasis from which he might one day be revived. They received regular reports from Dr. Schmidt herself, filled with clinical data on his stable cellular integrity and minimal metabolic signature. They were led to believe he was being kept alive by a miracle of science. In reality, Julien's frozen body had become one of the facility's most prized research subjects. In the frigid silence of cryogenic Suite 4, sensors and probes were attached to his inert form, measuring the slow, imperceptible decay of neural tissues at near absolute zero. He was no longer a patient. He was a data point. Dr. Schmidt's soul was freezing over, just like her patient's. Her journal entries lose their initial awe and adopt the cold, clinical language of her collaborators. January 11, 1895. The vitrification process on Subject 7 was a complete success. Kale's adjustments to the coolant mixture have all but eliminated ice crystallization in the neural tissue. The subject's terminal terror response was pronounced, but the resulting preservation is flawless. Dr. Finch has logged the psychological data. It is remarkable how the promise of eternal rest can pacify a mind, even as the body understands the truth. I find I no longer see their faces. I see the challenge. I see the variables. I see the work. This is the price of true progress. The correspondence with the outside world intensified. Finch was no longer just a physician. He was a vendor of unique, unobtainable knowledge. He sold datasets to universities in Berlin and London, carefully anonymized reports on human tissue response to extreme cryogenic conditions. He became a ghost author for papers published by less scrupulous academics, men who built their careers on the data harvested from the frozen bodies locked in the Weisshorn's heart. This growing reputation brought a new, even more disturbing kind of clientele. The facility quietly opened a charity wing, accepting patients whose families could not afford the exorbitant fees. These were the forgotten, the unloved, the anonymous. They were not patients. They were raw material for the riskiest experiments, tests of new chemical serums, adjustments to freezing duration, and explorations into the absolute limits of bodily preservation. Their disappearances went unnoticed. Their screams, if they had the warmth left to scream, were swallowed by insulated steel. You must understand the process itself. It was a symphony of horrors, refined into a science. It began with Finch. He was the psychopomp, the gentle guide to oblivion. He would spend weeks with a new patient speaking of philosophy of art of peace. He would soothe their fears of a painful death, offering instead a transition into perfect stillness. He was preparing their minds, making them compliant, sedating their souls before their bodies were taken. Then came Kale. The patient would be moved to one of the cryosuites. Herr Kale's work was brutally elegant. He had perfected the delivery systems, the network of pipes and nozzles that would envelop the subject in a precisely controlled cloud of liquid nitrogen vapor. The initial shock of cold was masked by a dose of morphine, but it was never enough. The true horror was that the subjects were conscious for the first critical 30 seconds, their minds fully aware as their bodies turned to stone, their last sensation the feeling of their own warmth being violently ripped away. Dr. Schmidt's role was to observe and document, monitoring biological responses on her array of instruments, her mind focused solely on the data, willfully blind to the human sacrifice generating it. Every death was a meticulously logged experiment. Lord Harrington, however, had not been pacified. The image of his father, the perfect waxwork, haunted him. He used his family's immense resources to begin a quiet, private investigation. He hired agents in Zurich to track the sanatorium's finances and supply chains. He began discreetly contacting the families of other Weisshorn patients. At first, he found nothing but praise for Dr. Finch's compassionate care, but then he found a pattern. He found 2 other families who had received nearly identical letters. He found another who had received a photograph of their resting mother, a photograph that filled them with the same nameless dread. They were all told the same thing. The patient was in a delicate, unvisitable stasis. The curtain of silence was beginning to tear. Harrington was no longer just a grieving son. He was a hunter, and he was beginning to pick up the scent. The instrument of the Weisshorn's undoing arrived in the autumn of 1895. Her name was Clara Vance. She was not a dying heiress or a broken poet. She was an American photojournalist, a woman whose profession was to look at the world with an unblinking, analytical eye. Her illness was a mild but persistent cough, yet her true malady, in the eyes of her powerful family, was her inconvenient dedication to the truth. She was on the verge of publishing an exposé that would have ruined a business associate of her father, and so she was sent away to the Alps, ostensibly to rest and recover. In reality, she was being exiled. From the moment she stepped off the cog railway, Clara knew the Weisshorn was a lie. Her trained eye saw not a hospital, but a meticulously constructed stage set. The other patients, the wealthy and the doomed, moved through their final days in a haze of laudanum and despair, but Clara's mind was sharp. She saw the peace in their eyes for what it was, the vacant resignation of the drugged. She noted the unnatural perfection of the decor, the sound-dampening qualities of the architecture, the way the staff moved with the quiet efficiency of prison guards, not nurses. Her background in chemistry, necessary for developing her photographs, made her instantly suspicious of Finch's lyrical descriptions of cryotherapeutics. She knew enough to understand that what he was describing was not healing. It was something else entirely. Finch tried his mesmerizing art on her, but for the first time, it failed. Her mind was a fortress he could not breach. She met his philosophical monologues with pointed, practical questions. She engaged Dr. Schmidt in technical conversations that revealed the gaping holes in her public explanations. Clara played the part of the compliant patient, but she was conducting the investigation of her life. She feigned weakness to be left alone, using the time to map the upper floors, to observe the timing of the patrols, to note which patients were taken to the special treatment wings and never returned. She scratched notes onto the back of photographic plates, a secret diary in silver nitrate. Her chance came on a brutally cold night in February, when the mountain itself seemed to intervene. A catastrophic failure in one of Kale's primary coolant lines in sublevel 2 created chaos. A pressure valve burst, flooding a section of the lower facility with dangerously cold gas. Alarms, never heard before, echoed through the stone corridors. Staff ran in panic, their practiced composure shattered. In the confusion, as guards were diverted to the emergency, Clara slipped away. She descended into the sanatorium's cold heart, a place far more terrifying than she had imagined. The sublevels were not cellars. They had the cold, clean geometry of a slaughterhouse. She found the cryogenic suites. They were not rooms, they were vaults. Peering through the thick, reinforced glass porthole of Suite 3, she saw the truth. Not a patient resting, but a collection. Rows upon rows of bodies, standing upright in glass cylinders, bathed in a shimmering, vaporous light. Each one perfectly preserved, their faces a gallery of frozen expressions, peace, confusion, and raw, silent terror. This was the Baroness von Hesse. This was the young composer, Julian, a library of the dead. The cold was a physical predator, but Clara pushed on, her breath fogging in the frigid air. She found Kale's workshop, a place of horrific pragmatism. On a steel table lay tools that were not medical instruments, but custom-made implements for invasive cryogenic preparation. And there, left open in the haste of the emergency, was a surgical ledger. She saw names, dates, and chillingly precise notes. Subbed. CT12, female, age 22. Excellent tissue preservation despite significant premortem resistance. Neural response to flash freezing logged for Berlin study. It was a catalog of murder. Knowing her time was short, she made her way to Finch's private study. The door was locked, but the emergency had left the building's power fluctuating. A magnetic lock had disengaged. Inside, she found the final damning proof, the correspondence files. Letters from universities, from private researchers, from wealthy industrialists. They were not inquiries about healing. They were purchase orders. A London physician bought data on long-term neural degradation at -100 degrees Celsius. A Viennese society paid a fortune for the permanent preservation of a blackballed member, a service rendered with a chilling invoice. It was a business. The Weisshorn was a factory, and its product was frozen human data. In a new ledger on a freshly opened page, she saw her own name, Clara Vance. Subject 27, scheduled for preservation, February 19th. Note, subject exhibits high intelligence and resistance, ideal for consciousness response study during initial phase. Her execution was scheduled for the next day. As the reality of her own impending death settled in, a new kind of cold, colder than the mountain itself, gripped her. This is the moment of transformation, when you understand the true nature of the machine that holds you captive. If this descent into the abyss is stirring something within you, share this with someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Hit the like button to signal that you are still with us. And subscribe so you are here when the final seal is broken. Clara's escape was an act of sheer will. She couldn't go back up. The alarm had been reset. The only way was down. She found a service dumbwaiter, a grimy, claustrophobic cage used to transport supplies from the kitchens. She pried the doors open and climbed inside, pulling the ropes, her hands raw and bleeding, the greasy cable burning her palms as she lowered herself into the mountain's gut. The search had begun. She could hear the heavy boots of Kale's men echoing above, their German commands sharp and brutal. She emerged in a cavernous sub-basement, next to the roaring fires of the power plant. She was in the belly of the beast. Choking on coal dust, she found an unguarded service tunnel, a dark, icy passage that led out onto the desolate, windswept face of the mountain, far from the cog railway, far from any path. Dressed only in the thin wool of a patient's gown, she stumbled out into the blizzard. The cold was a white-hot agony. The wind screamed like the souls of the damned. For 2 days she fought her way down the treacherous slope, hunted by Kale's men, who knew the mountain like the back of their hand. She survived on snow and the sheer burning fire of her rage. On the brink of death, half frozen and delirious, she collapsed at the edge of the tree line, leaving a faint trail of blood in the snow. It was there, as her vision faded to black, that a figure emerged from the trees. A local hunter named Matthias, a man who had long believed the sanatorium was a place of evil, found her. He wrapped her in furs, his face a grim mask of recognition. He did not take her to the local authorities, whom he knew were paid by Finch's gold. He carried her to a hidden cabin and began the slow, painful process of bringing the woman who held the truth back from the frozen edge of death. When Clara Vance, supported by the hunter Matthias, finally presented herself to federal authorities in Bern, she was met with a wall of polite, bureaucratic disbelief. A half-frozen American journalist babbling about a mountain fortress of frozen bodies sounded like the ravings of a mind shattered by exposure and grief. But Clara was not hysterical. She was a weapon. She laid her evidence on the table, the stolen pages from the surgical ledger, the damning correspondence, and the photographic plates on which she had etched her notes. Her credibility was absolute. She didn't just tell a story. She dissected the Weisshorn's entire operation with the cold precision of a surgeon. She detailed Kale's engineering, Finch's psychological methods, and Schmidt's medical complicity. She described the layout of the sublevels, the chemical composition of the cryofluids she had smelled, the exact locations of the master control panels. This was not memory. It was a forensic report delivered from the grave. The documents she carried were the final, undeniable proof. The surgical ledger's entry for Subject 12 described in chillingly passive language how a young woman's pre-mortem terror had been a valuable data point for our study on the neurochemistry of fear. The correspondence file was a ledger of damnation, containing explicit purchase orders for human data from some of Europe's most prestigious scientific minds. And the patient catalog, with its neat columns and coded dispositions, archived, expired, and processed, revealed the scale of the slaughter. The authorities in Bern realized this was not a simple case of medical malpractice. This was a systematic, industrial-scale enterprise of murder for scientific profit. A special unit of the Swiss Federal Army was dispatched, ascending the mountain not on the elegant cog railway, but on foot with military stealth. By the time they stormed the Weisshorn Sanatorium 2 days later, it was too late. They found a ghost palace. Finch, Kale, and their core staff had vanished. A skeleton crew of junior nurses and domestic staff were found drugged and incoherent, left behind as a final, contemptuous delay tactic. The perpetrators had been monitoring federal communications. Their escape had been planned for years. What the soldiers discovered in the sublevels would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They breached the steel doors of the cryogenic suites to find the library of the dead, 312 glass cylinders, each containing a perfectly preserved human being, standing in silent, frozen testament to Finch's work. The bodies of the wealthy were displayed like works of art. But in a secondary, cruder chamber, they found the bodies of the charity patients, dozens of them, imperfectly frozen, some fractured and broken from failed experiments, discarded like ruined prototypes. In a hidden incinerator, they found the ash and bone fragments of at least 50 more. The only high-level collaborator captured was Dr. Anneliese Schmidt. They found her in her quarters, catatonic, clutching her journal, the ink on the final page still wet. Under interrogation, her professional facade shattered, and in a torrent of guilt and horror, she confessed everything. She revealed the true identities of her partners. Dr. Alastair Finch was an alias for Julian Croft, a disgraced Cambridge neuroscientist expelled in 1885 for conducting unauthorized electrical experiments on asylum inmates. Herr Kale was Dieter Voss, a former Prussian military engineer who had specialized in building fortified, self-sufficient structures for clandestine government projects. They had met in Vienna, two men cast out by society, united by a shared, godless vision of science without limits. They had recruited Schmidt not for her expertise, but for her ambition, knowing it would be the leash by which they controlled her. The international manhunt that followed was the largest in European history, but it was a pantomime. Croft and Voss were ghosts. Financial records revealed a labyrinth of shell corporations and bank accounts stretching from Argentina to the Ottoman Empire. They had amassed a fortune, not just from their wealthy patients, but from the sale of their data. They had escaped roots, false identities, and powerful allies who had benefited from their research. The full, horrifying scope of the Weisshorn enterprise came to light. Over 400 people had entered. None had left alive. They were either archived, expired, or disposed of. The network of complicity was staggering. Respected academics in at least 4 countries had built their careers on stolen lives. Industrialists had paid for the convenient and silent disappearance of inconvenient relatives. But the most chilling discovery was the conspiracy of silence. When the families of the victims were discreetly contacted by authorities, almost all of them refused to press charges. The shame of their loved one's illness, compounded by the scandal of their fate, was too much. To admit what happened would be to admit they had willingly sent their kin to a factory of death. To protect their names, they chose to bury the truth. The investigation was quietly closed. The evidence was sealed. The official story became one of a fraudulent doctor who had absconded with his patients' money. The Weisshorn Sanatorium was dynamited, its white stone and glass reduced to rubble and swept away by an avalanche, a deliberate act of erasure. But the knowledge, the data meticulously logged in the ledgers Clara had saved, was not destroyed. It was absorbed into the anonymous archives of medical science, its monstrous origins scrubbed clean, contributing to the very fields of cryogenics and neurology it had so horrifically pioneered. Clara Vance lived the rest of her life in the shadow of the mountain. The trauma of what she had seen and endured left her unable to return to her old life. She became a recluse, trusted by no one, haunted by the faces in the glass cylinders. Her memoir, published privately and dismissed as sensationalist fiction, remains the only complete public account of the Weisshorn's crimes. Croft and Voss were never found. A decade later, an unconfirmed report placed a man matching Croft's description running a rejuvenation clinic for the elite in Brazil. Another rumor spoke of an engineer resembling Voss overseeing the construction of a mysterious, fortified research facility deep in the Russian steppes. The truth is, they simply vanished, leaving behind the chilling possibility that they, or men like them, are still out there, pursuing knowledge at any cost, on some other mountain, in some other guise, waiting for the next patient. The story of the Weisshorn Sanatorium is not a simple tale of murder. It is a parable, a blueprint for the perfect fusion of scientific ambition, capitalist exploitation, and society's desperate need to look away. What Croft and Voss created on that mountain was a flawlessly efficient machine for converting human life into profitable data. Their currency was the terror of the dying. Their product was knowledge, stripped of all morality. You must understand the most disturbing legacy of the Weisshorn. The data was not lost. The ledgers Clara Vance rescued, filled with the final moments of hundreds of souls, were not simply burned. They were studied. Their horrific origins were scrubbed away, and the cold, hard facts were absorbed into the bloodstream of medical progress. The knowledge was laundered. Techniques in cell preservation, theories on neural response to trauma, advances that we may benefit from today, have roots in that frozen soil. They are built upon a foundation of silent screams. But the true horror is not the evil of 2 men and their collaborator. It is the mirror the Weisshorn holds up to the world that allowed it to exist. The conspiracy of silence from the families, who chose reputation over justice, was the final, critical component of the machine. It was the victim's second death, the erasure of their story, the burying of their suffering. It proved Finch's ultimate cynical theory, that society fears scandal more than it abhors evil. This is the power they don't want you to understand, that great atrocities are rarely the work of monsters alone. They require a system of quiet complicity. Now it is time for you to choose. Are you merely a spectator, or are you one of us? The first step in breaking the chains of deception is to acknowledge you can see them. In the comments below, I want you to write a single symbolic phrase. Write it twice to affirm it. I see the pattern. I see the pattern. By doing this, you are not just telling an algorithm that you are here. You are telling yourself that your eyes are now open. Ask yourself, where are the Weisshorns of today? Hidden in plain sight, disguised as progress, as convenience, as security. What suffering is being rendered invisible for the benefit of the few? The methods change. The technology evolves. But the pattern remains. The pursuit of power, disguised as knowledge. The exploitation of the vulnerable, disguised as charity. If you are ready to continue this journey, subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. Share this with one other person you know is strong enough to handle the truth. The shadows of our world are deep, and they hide more than just stories from the past. The truth is not buried. It is merely waiting for eyes willing to see it, and we will show you where to look.